Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Historia Politica Publica. In the episode of today, I will talk about the beginning of the Cold War, focusing in Italy and the elections that happened 1948, and it is a clear example of what was going on in the continent and all the world, because you have the recent formed Christian Democrats that appeared in 1943. They allied themselves with the communists in Italy in order to defeat the regime of Mussolini and finish with fascism in the country. But when the elections came after the end of the Second World War, some years later, there was a huge campaign of propaganda instigated by the United States in order to avoid the victory of the Communist Party in Italy, which had great appeal after the incredible role of many of the communists in the resistance when the partisans went going through the mountain in order to defeat the Black Shirts of Mussolini. So I will talk about that in the episode, and if there is time, I want to analyze also the clash between communists and capitalism at the beginning of the Cold War in other areas of Europe. Otherwise, I will leave to other episodes because there is much information to delve into it. So, it is important to say that in Italy, Catholic anti-communism emerged in a society which was at its limits. There was the Second World War, fascism, which had been imposed in the country since 1922, when Mussolini became the dictatorship of Italy, so he was in power over than 20 years. There was the role of the partisans in the resistance. There is a movie which is called Novecento, which explains all this process from 1901 until 1945 very well. The movie is 5 hours long, so they touch many of these aspects. Also, there is a documentary called The Cold War, directed with the voice of Kenneth Branagh, in which there is one particular episode which focused just on the Italian elections, a part of huge amount of literature, obviously. The thing is, during the civil war in Italy, between the partisans and the loyals to Mussolini, there was a rise of consciousness. And in fact, there were 2 million people who were affiliated to the Italian Communist Party. In the words of Palmiro Togliatti, which was the leader of the Italian Communist Party, this was, quote, the Italian road to socialism, end quote. So, where Stalin has defined the Soviet Union as socialism in one country, and later on in China it will be this idea of socialism with Chinese approach. Here, Palmiro Togliatti also wanted to create a kind of nationalistic system in order to engage with the population to expand the ideas of communism. There was a contradiction between communist masses and the leaders, nonetheless, because the Italian Communist Party, according to Rosario Forlenza, quote, encouraged the movement, but at the same time wished to avert a radicalization which could become an element of disturbance to the difficult governmental equilibrium, end quote. In other words, same as the Jacobins did in the French Revolution, same as in the American Civil War or during the revolutions of 1848, the leaders used the masses in order to push for the reforms. However, they also were concerned that this movement of the masses will eventually overthrow them, and they wanted to keep the privileges. This is a kind of a common symptom that has been happening in every revolution in the last 300 years. And I mean, we can even go further if we think in the English Civil War led by Oliver Cromwell, in which there was also this kind of more radical elements of society like the levelers or the diggers, which were classed by Cromwell and his college because they just wanted to change a bit aspects of the system, but by the way, they never wanted to establish a new society, as this kind of more left-wing movement tried to do so. So, in that sense, in Italy, it makes sense that the former partisans who had been fighting in the mountains for many years refused to surrender their weapons. There was labor unrest, grassroots movement. There is a book which is called History people's history of the Second World War, and it precisely described how in some Italian cities it was the partisans who had defeated fascism. And when the American representative came to the city to mention how the Allies have won the area, somebody in Italy told him, yes, now you go there and speak with those Italians who had fought for many years so courageously and tell them that their fight has been in vain, and at the end they won't establish an egalitarian society. This is an example of the importance of the resistance in many parts of Europe, such as France, Italy, Albania, or Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia perhaps is the best example about the fight from below. And after some years, in 1948, Tito, Joseph Broz Tito, the leader of Yugoslavia, split with Stalin because he wanted to follow the revolutionary ideals that they have been fighting for many years. So, in Italy, after the experience of fascism and war, people were discovering democracy's quiet virtues and the space it left for privacy, the individual, and the family. In other words, they wanted a retreat from the public to the private sphere. This is mentioned by Rosario Forlenza in his essay, The Enemy Within, Catholic Anti-Communism in Cold War Italy, also by Mark Massauer in his book Dark Continent, which I have analyzed in other episodes. This idea that after many decades fighting in the First World War, interwar period, Second World War, years of hunger, of misery, of rage, of losing their homes, losing relatives and so on, you had a time after 1947, especially when Europe started to rebuild itself again, in which people suddenly realized how they were exhausted after many years, and with the levels of consumption, with the implementation of fridges, washing machines, and all this kind of invention that many of them came from the US, they prefer to stay at home. It seems a very kind of romantic idea of what happened in Europe, and for sure there were more detailed explanations about this process, but still many historians have researched about that, and the whole conclusion is precisely that with the propaganda implemented by the USA, also the blocs, the Cold War, the blocs between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and after many years fighting and with the possibility to enjoy more goods, more leisure in your country, people were able to retreat from the public sphere. In fact, it's important, the welfare state created after 1945 in many parts of Europe. The welfare state was obviously a kind of stronghold against the menace of communism. This happened in England with the NHS. This happened. The NHS is the free health system, the hospitals, which happened in 1945, and also in France, in Italy, in other areas. They develop a strong welfare state in order to appease the working class movement, which has been very involved during the Second World War, doing protests and organizing resistance and so on. This had been done by Bismarck in 1883, precisely in order to avoid the threat of socialism in Germany at the time, which was very powerful, and henceforth, when the people are pushing for more radical reforms, many times the leaders are forced to give many concessions to the people. And precisely for that reason, it is important to protest, because even though it will probably never reach the demands that people want, at least they will have some compromises, as happened in French May with the general strike, as happened during the revolutions of 1848, in 1789, and many other examples after the Second World War also, and so on. And as I mentioned, with the Germany, the recent founded country in 1883 by Otto von Bismarck. So coming back to Italy, we have how the Catholic Church took part in the struggle against communism, and this is very important because the role of propaganda in a conservative religious country as Italy had this significant role in order to make the Christian Democrats win the elections against the Communist Party. It was a real threat for the Italian elites that the Communist Party would attain the power, because there was huge appeal among the Italians for the role of the communists during the Second World War to defeating fascism, and obviously after many years organizing themselves. In that sense, the Vatican newspaper, the Vatican was fundamental in that role, especially with the authoritarian conservative Pope Pius XII. And in this newspaper, which is called L'Osservatore Romano, it was said that, quote, "no one could be a Catholic and a communist at the same time," end quote. Another newspapers proceed in the same line. So what is being said here is that because they know that many people in Italy believe in God and they are Catholic, but at the same time many of those are also communists, they need to choose a side. And through the propaganda in the country, with the help of the United States, which were paying for many of these campaigns, also the idea of the Catholic Church is embedded in society within the church, the rituals, obviously the idea of going to Mass on Sunday at 12 and so on. So it is not just a faith, but also a way of life. And if you go now to countries like Malta, you can perfectly see that, why there is like it's very small island, but there are churches everywhere. It's an interesting country because you have the architecture of the Arabs when they were in the island in Malta, but all the churches and so on are Catholic Christian. In that sense, one of the ideas that the Catholic Church and the Catholics in general in power made in order to diminish communism was that precisely this idea, communism, was the product of modernity and hence incompatible with Catholicism. This was a culmination of a line born with the Reformation and continuing with the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. In other words, according to Riccardo Lombardi, quote, "this is a translation of historical materialism into concrete action," end quote. Historical materialism, the idea developed by Marx and Engels, in which it is the force of production that are developing the new ideas in society, and therefore the Reformation came in a time in which the press was being implemented. There was the role of the pamphlet was being fundamental, as Martin Luther was precisely putting many pamphlets, many advertisements in Germany. I think it was 1521. And this created a consciousness among the people. Obviously, were a year of technological advance. With the French Revolution, we have the importance of the roads in France in order to carry the message from Paris to other parts of the country to spread the ideas of the revolution. The Enlightenment in a time in which the publication of books was being huge, and obviously the ideas of Kant, Voltaire, Rousseau, Humboldt, and many others could be read by an important part of at least the intellectual population, which obviously at the time, comparing with the illiterate, it was not that huge. But obviously it was seen as a process, like from the Reformation, Enlightenment, French Revolution, and finally communism. Coming back to the Pope Pius XII, he wondered if France and Italy would fall to a, quote, materialistic state without otherworldly ideals and religion. So here the dichotomy between materialism and kind of faith, spirituality, was being embedded in the whole Italian society. For that reason, in order to spread the Catholic ideas to defeat communism, the grassroots priest movements were important because they were written pamphlets, graffiti, and documents to expose that communism is against every religion. This is their words. And many of those, as I mentioned earlier, were read at Sunday Mass. So, in other words, they saw communism as a threat to hierarchical family and civilization. In that sense, you have to think that if you are going to Sunday to church every Sunday, and you see a lot of people there, and the priest is reading a pamphlet against communism, obviously you will listen attentively, and when you go out you will speak with your colleagues, and it will make you think probably that communism is evil. This is very well explained in the documentary Cold War, in which there are testimonies of Italians who explain how they were communists in the 1940s, but they also were Catholics. And there was a couple that I spoke in the documentary that they were affiliated to the Communist Party and they wanted to get married, and they were not allowed to do so unless they refused to vote for the Communist Party in the elections. And obviously they suffer a lot, they cry, and the one of them, he mentioned how he cried a lot when the Communist Party lost the election in 1948. For him it was a chance that was missed to change society, and so on. And obviously they were persecuted indirectly. I mean, they were not punished, like, let's say, with sheer violence, but it was this kind of propaganda which made their life difficult, isolate themselves from their relatives, and so on. And this was through a huge program of propaganda across the whole Italy. And even though the CIA years later admitted how they, in case that the Communist Party won the elections, they had the army near Italy in order to establish a coup d'etat, same as they did in Guatemala later, same as they did in Chile in 73, and they also were prepared to do that in 74 in Portugal after the Carnage Revolution, in case that the communists attained the power. So this is the global context of the Cold War, the intervention of the United States against communism, the intervention of the Soviet Union in other parts of the world against imperialism, and the ideas of the United States. So you had a time in Europe in which the superpowers had great influence of what was happening there. I will talk also in another episode about the Sovietization of Eastern Europe, which was made mostly by force, and so on. So you have those kind of countries dominating almost everything. So in 1943, like 2 years before the end of the war, it was created Democracia Cristiana, the Christian Democrats, which initially it was refused by the Pope Pius XII because he preferred a clerical, conservative, authoritarian regime like in Spain as Portugal with Franco and Salazar, respectively, because he rejected the Christian democracy's pluralism. Also, Pope Pius XII was concerned because the Italian Communist Party and the Christian Democrats had collaborated to defeat fascism during the Second World War. In that sense, and this is very important, there was a constitution in Italy after the Second World War. After the Second World War, the monarchy in Italy was overthrown. Mussolini was defeated in 43, fascism was defeated in 45, the monarchy was overthrown because they had support fascism, so it was created a republic in Italy. And henceforth, with this new system, it was needed a new constitution. What is happening is that the Italian constitution was very famous because it was called the anti-fascist constitution. It was many legislation in order to avoid fascism come back to Italy. Obviously, we see how nowadays this has fallen, and I mean, it sounds very romantic, but in 1946 there was a neo-fascist party who was able to present to the elections anyway. So, I mean, it sounds very good in paper in order to avoid the most violent of the ideologies to permeate again in the country. But next year, the neo-fascists were again trying to reach power. Obviously, they were a minority because people, most of the people did not trust in them. But still, the idea of the constitution was very important, and the thing is, in that sense, both the leader of the Christian Democrats, which was called De Gasperi, and the leader of the Communist Party, Palmiro Togliatti, believed that the Catholic and the communist ideas were related, because both of them, Catholicism in the way that Jesus Christ, in the way that follows Jesus' ideas, and communist, it is an approach to create an egalitarian society, share your resources with everybody, help those people in need, engage with people in community, understand the importance of each other, create a kind of system of solidarity. It is not just about elections in politics and so on, but also the way that you behave to the others. We have the famous quotes of Jesus in the Bible, such as the you need to love and be loved. It is more difficult for a camel to enter in the tiny eye of the sting rather than for a rich person entering the sky, in the heaven, sorry. And this kind of ideas that obviously made Jesus Christ a radical, because his philosophy of life was very aligned with the anarcho-communist ideas of today. So in that sense, it is not surprised that in Italy, as I mentioned earlier, many Catholics were communists also. So, in fact, there were 8 million people who voted for the Popular Front in 1948, and 1 out of 3 Italians was communist at the end of the 1940s. I mean, this is crazy. 1 out of 3 Italians were communists, 1940s. So, more than 30%. This is incredible. In that sense, De Gasperi, the leader of the Christian Democrats, and his followers avoided the Vatican authoritarianism, the idea that they could not ally with the communists because they were evil and so on. And De Gasperi replied to him, listen, the only evils that are here are the fascists. We cannot ally with them, and henceforth here is the anti-fascist constitution signed by the Communist Party and the Christian Democrats. So De Gasperi said, listen, we will defeat communists through liberal democratic values, so we will win them in the elections in a fair way, but we cannot create a constitution to stop communists to reach power, because they have shown their bravery fighting against fascism, joining the resistance, and so on. So it's fundamental. And also, De Gasperi rejected the Washington plan to outlaw the Italian Communist Party, which was something that was trying to be perpetrated by the United States. In that sense, the anti-fascist constitution was very important to trying to stop the destruction of democracy, as De Gasperi put it in that way. So with this context, we have the parliamentary elections that happened the 18th of April 1948, 3 years after the war. And the Christian Democrats was against the Popular Front. The Popular Front was a coalition led by the Italian Communist Party and other left-wing forces. In that sense, the huge machine of propaganda started to work fully, and there were binary terms in order to define this election as a holy crusade, religion or atheism, good against evil, the Europe against Asia. Asia were the communists in theory, because communism was established in a Soviet Union. You have all this kind of Manichaeism being perpetrated by the priests, as I mentioned, the Pope, the propaganda carried on by the United States, and so on. There were historical references to legitimize their fight against communism, such as the Battle of Lepanto against the Ottoman Empire, like Christianity against the Arabs, depicting communists as bloody beasts. Churchill and Adenauer, for instance, the Prime Minister of England and the Prime Minister of West Germany, although Churchill at that time was not the Prime Minister, he had just been defeated in the elections of 1945 against the Labour Party by Bevan. Also, both refer to communism as an Asiatic ideology threatening European civilization, the idea of communists being Asian people. So you see here the racism inherent in all these Western leaders in order to diminish the possibilities of the Communist Party. So in post-war Italy, Catholic anti-communism provide the citizens, the intellectuals, and the former elite of fascist Italy with an acceptable means of expressing conservative and racist view. As we have just seen, not just them, but also Churchill, Adenauer, the fascist people who had been defeated had their chance to try to legitimize themselves in society, and while they were joining in the neo-fascist hubs in Madrid from 1946, in Italy they were also trying to operate to overthrow communism. In that sense, in July 1949, 1 year after the Communist Party lost the election against the Christian Democrats, after the huge propaganda carried by the Italian society, by the United States and so on, I think the elections was won by the Communist Party. I think they took almost 40% of the vote, but the Christian Democrats won by far. I think it was, not remember correctly, but I think it was like 62-38, something like that. And 1 year later, in July 1949, the Holy Office announced the formal excommunication of communists. The church promoted a secret union between the Christian Democrats, the monarchists, and the neo-fascists in order to form a common anti-communist front to create a Francoist Italy. In other words, the idea of the Second World War, the fight against the fascists, the resistance, the role of the partisans, and so on, was trying to be crushed by the propaganda of monarchists and fascists who had been in power some years before, and they did not want to kind of give away this power. They wanted to become part of the Christian Democrats in its more radical approach. However, again, it was the Gasperi and the Christian Democrats that refused this idea, and the monarchists and the conservative neo-fascists and other conservative, they had to just surrender their aims, although they kept doing by many decades in society, and still nowadays this is the result after years of pushing to become legitimate again. And now we have Giorgia Meloni, an heir of the neo-fascist party in Italy, as prime minister in Italy. But it's important to think that just some years after the end of the Second World War, how the role of propaganda in society could change the whole intellectual paradigm in the country. For instance, you have Giuseppe Dossetti, a Catholic, had fought alongside Palmiro Togliatti in the resistance and collaborated with him in the writing of the Constitution. In 1949, there was a decree was criticized even by priests who denounced the church for alienating parts of societies and tried to establish contact with communists. So, this is important because even some priests refused the official approach of the church because they believe that the communists could not be excommunicated for their importance to win the war, and they established contact with them and denounced the church for trying to establish this Manichaeism between good and evil, God and godless, atheism, religion, and so on. So the thing what Italy did is, like many elites trying to change the approach, and instead of depicting the communists as kind of evils, what they did was depicting them as humans, but nice humans, but folly and naive. And this was done through movies, and it was an effective manner, as the use of humor, it might be most effective than straightforward attacks. This was a new strategy. This is also mentioned in the documentary how there were many movies or many animation movies in which the character, which was a communist, was basically a silly person, which obviously you cannot be angry with him or her, but still you cannot even listen to him or her. So this is a new approach. Obviously, Hollywood had his influence here because the movies in the United States are incredible smart to the use of propaganda, because sometimes it does not seem so explicit but more subtle, and in that way ideology can permeate better in society. So just to finish the episode, some conclusions. Anti-communism was not just a Christian strategy to win elections, but in a time of socio-political and existential uncertainty, millions of Italians found reassurance in a message as simple in its basic elements as it was profound in its implication. This whole sentence is said by Rosario Forlenza in his essay The Enemy Within, Catholic Anti-Communism in Cold War Italy. So this was a dichotomy between good and evil, and it was a kind of the idea of establish the ideology of Christianism in society, even though it was already rooted in Italy, but also to give a new approach after the Second World War in a time which people needed reassurance, tranquility, not involved too much in the public sphere. So we can conclude that the Christian Democrats' strategy was a huge success. They obviously had the materialistic support of the United States, of the Pope, the Vatican, and so on. And even though Communist Party was not defeated and they kept doing quite well in the next decades, still the opportunity that had raised in 1945 after the victory of the resistance had been diminished, and in that sense Italy became again a country which had been saved from the Second World War. It was a republic, and it seems that overall people was happy towards a new future, which at that time at least it seemed peaceful and with many important ideas to carry on.